Hello. I'd like to present an idea that I have never heard anybody else mention about the argument of Asian DNA in the Book of Mormon and how people argue that DNA evidence doesn't support the Book of Mormon. This is an aspect that I'll present, and there are, however, modern evidences of DNA evidence for supporting Mediterranean DNA in the Book of Mormon, as the Cherokee Indians claim that their DNA comes from the Mediterranean area. And not all Native Americans, of course, have DNA that go back to the Mediterranean area, but the Native Americans of the Northeast part of the Northern American continent do have newly discovered DNA that traces back to the Mediterranean area, but that's not what this is about. I'll present some other ideas about Asian DNA support, possibly, a theory in the Book of Mormon. When members of the LDS Church speak about the Book of Mormon and the migration to Americas, or the immigration to Americas, they forget that there were three groups. Often they forget to mention that. They are good at talking about Lehi and his group, but they forget about Mulek, the son of Zedekiah, and particularly they forget about the Jaredites. The story of the Jaredites was during the Tower of Babel, which was approximately 2,200 years BC, 100 or so years after the flood of Noah. And if you are going to, if you're a Christian, you cannot argue that the Americans, Native Americans, have DNA traced back to Asia from 50,000 years ago, because the flood did not take place 50,000 years ago. The flood took place about 2,400 or 2,200 years before Christ. So, because the flood killed everybody on earth except Noah and his family, it is not possible, if you have a biblical perspective and believe in the Bible, that Native Americans have DNA dating back to Asia more than about 2,000 years before Christ. And I might have said 2,000 years ago. I meant 2,400 or so years before Christ. So there is no DNA on Earth that dates back to Asia, unless you're going to say that Noah and his DNA is Asian, and that Noah's ancestors' DNA was Asian, and that Adam's DNA was Asian. And even then, you can't go back 50,000 years. If you believe in the Bible, you can only go back about 4,000 years before Christ to Adam's DNA. And so the story of the Book of Mormon includes the Jaredites, who lived around the Tower of Babel. And according to scholars and history, after the time of the flood, everybody lived and settled in the land of Shinar. That's Genesis chapter 11, verse 1 and 2. And the Tower of Babel was in the plain of Shinar, and to prevent themselves from being scattered, they built the tower. And God cursed them for trying to build a tower that reached to heaven, and God dispersed them. And God intervened by confounding the languages, confusing their languages, causing them all to break up into separate groups with several different languages, and God dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Genesis 11, 8 through 9. And this act caused the scattering of the people into different groups and regions, leading to diverse nations described in the Table of Nations, Genesis chapter 10. Therefore, before the Tower of Babel incident, the account suggests that vast majority of the people were concentrated near, this is artificial intelligence, this isn't my writing, near the location where they built the tower, the plain of Shinar. After the Tower of Babel, they were dispersed. Okay, now, biblical chronology. Peleg's birth. Peleg was born 101 years after the flood. Okay, now they believe When it says in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided, there's lots of theories. Some people believe that at the time it was Pangea, and where there was just one continent, and that in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. It means the physical earth where the continents divided. Um, that's one theory. The other theory is in the days of Peleg is when um, the earth was divided because of the Tower of Babel. But Peleg was born 101 years after the flood, and the Tower of Babel took place sometime quite after that. It was 300 years after the flood that the Tower of Babel began to be built. Um, so anyhow, that's when the Jaredites lived. They lived near the Tower of Babel, and they, at the time of the confounding of the languages, their language was not confounded because they prayed and asked God that they could keep their language, the original language that existed before Noah. And from the Tower of Babel area, which was Mesopotamia, the area which is now Iraq, modern day Iraq, the land of Shinar, they went northward to a place called Nimrod. And the biblical figure Nimrod is strongly associated with ancient Mesopotamia and the founding of the cities Shinar and Assyria, Nineveh. The term land of Nimrod is used in the Bible and is synonymous for Assyria, according to Micah chapter 5, verse 6. Northern Mesopotamia or Eastern Turkey. Some Latter-day scholars have pointed out to the geographical features of the region of Lake Van in East Turkey, where the name Nimrod has been associated with various geographical sites, such as Nimrut Dagi, which is interpreted Mount Nimrod. The area represents the highlands and valleys north of central Mesopotamia plain. In summary, the consensus among those who study the Jaredite journey place the Valley of Nimrod in the Near East, likely in the mountain regions of northern Iraq or eastern Turkey, which is indeed north of the Tower of Babel. Now that's what they believe. They're not sure. It's just some ideas. So I asked the question, does the Book of Mormon say that the Jaredites reached a large body of water and had to build boats to get across it before they built other large ships that were tight like into a dish, where they crossed the great deep? So they had a place of many waters, which were probably large lakes. They built boats. They settled there for a long time, built boats, traveled again after they went to the other side of these waters, traveled again by foot, and then settled again for many years, and then built more ships across which they traveled the great deep, meaning the large ocean. And a sea back then was, another word for sea is large lake. In other languages, the word for lake is sea. So, two possible water travels. Okay, crossing many waters in the wilderness. After leaving the Valley of Nimrod and traveling through the wilderness, the Jaredites were still in the Eastern Hemisphere. Record states that they did travel in the wilderness and built barges in which they did cross many waters, being directed continually by the hand of the Lord. The first set of barges was used to cross various bodies of water, lakes, rivers, or small seas on their journey toward the Great Sea. Crossing the Great Sea in tight barges. So after they crossed many waters, again, just like I said, they got to the Great Sea, which divided the lands. So this is interesting, and I'd never thought of this. The Jaredites eventually arrived at the Great Sea, which divided the lands. Now, how did they know that the Great Sea, which took months to cross, so we know it was the ocean, either the Atlantic or the Pacific, but it took them, by the length of time it described, it's probably the Pacific, and scientists have been saying that the only likely path that the Jaredites could have taken, being that they didn't have sailboats and they weren't rowing, all they had was these submarine type boats. They had a top and a bottom, and the water could splash over and it wouldn't get in. the only way that they could have gotten to America, the Americas, is through a natural water current that could have pulled them from East Asia over to the American continent. And there's no natural current like that in the Atlantic Ocean. So without paddles, without oars, without sails, the likelihood is this natural ocean current. And according to scientists, the number of days it took the Jaredites to get to get to America would have been about the same time that it would take traveling through this current. So it's likely they came from East Asia. So that's the story. And so here's what I asked. I said, if they had come across, I asked artificial intelligence this, if they had come across many waters in the wilderness somewhere north or east of the Tower of Babel area, would it mean there must have been mountains too difficult to cross with large families and supplies? And I could have also said flocks, and they had seeds and animals. And so it was easier to build ships and cross water than going through the mountains. That's what I asked artificial intelligence. Its answer is, the theory that the Jaredites built barges to cross many waters in the wilderness is an alternative to traversing difficult mountains. It is a plausible interpretation, strongly supported by the ancient geography of the region. The core reasons supporting this possibility are: 1. The geographic reality of Mesopotamia and its borders. The general area of the Tower of Babel is traditionally associated with Babylon, Shinar, and Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. Mountains of the northeast, north/east, a journey northward or eastward from the flat Mesopotamian plain immediately runs into major mountain ranges, approximately the Zagros Mountains to the northeast, spanning modern Iraq and Iran, and the mountainous region of Anatolia, Armenia, the northwest. So there's mountains on the east and the west at the north. And we know that the Jaredites went into the north. That's what they said, from the Mesopotamia area. So they could have gone into as far as the Caucasus. Difficulty of crossing these mountain ranges are rugged and historically proposed major logistical challenges for ancient travelers, especially large groups like the Jaredites with flocks, families, herds, seeds of every kind. So the family, there was the brother of Jared and Jared, and they each had something like 20 children. I think one had 12 and one had 24, I forget. And they had their friends and their friends' wives and their friends' families, their friends' children. So there was a large group of people. Moving, this says thousands. I don't think there were thousands, but there could have been hundreds or close to a couple of hundred. Probably at least 100 people. Moving many people of livestock and supplies through high, difficult passes would be incredibly slow and dangerous, potentially for years. 2. Water as an ancient highway. In the ancient Near East, river systems and waterways were often the most efficient way to traverse a large number of people and goods, functioning as natural highways, rivers and seas. The Book of Ether indicates the Jaredites journeyed from the plains down back then was, could be northward or down, not necessarily in elevation, but sometimes when people say down, they're talking about towards the poles, into the valley northward. The name of the valley was Nimrod. From the Great Plain of Shinar from the Great Plain of Shinar, the easiest way to move north or east and avoid the most difficult mountain passages would be to follow the water systems. Many waters. The reference of crossing many waters, Ether 2:6, before reaching the Great Sea suggests that a series of smaller crossings, likely a combination of rivers, like the Tigris or Euphrates or their tributaries, inland seas, gulfs, or bodies of water that offered a more difficult path through or around the difficult terrain than an overland route across high mountains. Therefore, building barges for the early part of the journey could have been a divinely directed strategy to leverage the path of the least logistical resistance for a mass migration, avoiding the greater physical obstacle and dangers of the major mountains. Now, this doesn't talk about the Caucasus. The Black Sea, if they went one direction, they could have gone to the gone across the Black Sea, or another direction, they could have gone across the Caspian Sea. Both of those seas have lots of mountain passes around them, and it would have been much easier to go across the seas, the Black Sea or Caspian Sea, than to go through the mountains. Then that's what this here says. The Tower of Babel region is traditionally located in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. When considering large inland bodies of water that would be north or northeast of that area in the ancient times, roughly 3rd millennium BC, the two most significant possibilities are the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, which sometimes behaved as a massive inland lake. I guess sometimes they may have been joined, I don't know. The Caspian Sea, on the northeast, is the most geographically relevant and massive inland body of water that fits the direction of the escape route around the mountains to the northeast. Size and status. It is the world's largest inland body of water by surface area. Even today, it is technically a lake, although it is immense in size and brackish, somewhat salty water. It's often called a sea. Even now, it's called a sea. Ancient extent. While its water level fluctuated dramatically throughout the history in the period you are referring to, 3rd millennium BC, it is clearly a colossal barrier or path. The journey northeast from the Mesopotamia would lead towards the Zagros Mountains and ultimately the massive sea. Context for travel. If a group's ultimate destination was far to the east or across Asia, skirting the rugged Zagros Caucasian Mountains by utilizing the Caspian Sea as a transport route would be a logical strategy, even if it required difficult shipbuilding. Okay, so building a ship would be a lot easier than even crossing the mountains. The Black Sea, to the northwest, if they went westward. I'm not going to talk so much about that. I'm just going to stick with the same scenario happens if they went west, but I'm just going to argue, for the sake of argument, that they went east. I'm just going to go with a theory, possible plausibility of going east. The Aral Sea. This is a totally different sea. While very far to the northeast, the Aral Sea was once the 4th largest lake in the world, and in ancient times was also a vast body of water. There's no way Joseph Smith would have known that. In ancient times, not modern times, meaning not in the days of Joseph Smith, the Aral Sea was not the 4th largest landmass. Now, I'm not saying the Jaredites went through the Aral Sea, but if they did, there's no way Joseph Smith would have known that the Aral Sea existed. It exists now, but I think it's a very small lake if it does, but it's not the 4th largest in the world. If the people traveled across a great distance through Central Asia, the Aral Sea basin would have been a significant geographical feature. Given the premises of avoiding difficult mountain crossings with families and supplies, mountains to avoid, a journey directly north or east of Babylon quickly encounters the Taurus northwest, or Zagros northeast mountain range. Water route using the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, initially transportation arteries allow large groups of family, we kind of talked about that, to go through the rugged area. These rivers systems eventually led towards the coast of the Persian Gulf, that's south, and the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea to the north, northeast and northwest. The ability to build ships or large boats and traverse the vast, relatively navigable surface of the Caspian Sea or large inland locked Black Sea would, for a mass migration, be significantly easier and faster than attempting to haul supplies and livestock over the steep natural passes of the towering Caucasus or Zagros Mountains. And then I ask this, is that something Joseph Smith would likely have known? I didn't ask it about the aerial sea. This is what it says. It says he would have, I'm just going to paraphrase, he would have known about the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea because he would have had, Joseph Smith could have had access to maps that showed the Caspian and Black Sea. But when it comes to this, it says knowledge of ancient fluctuations. It is highly unlikely he, Joseph Smith, would have known from common secular knowledge the sophisticated geographical fact that the Black Sea and Caspian Sea were once part of a large ancient body of water, the Parethethus Sea. Okay, there was part of a larger ancient body of water, the Parethethus Sea. Joseph Smith couldn't have known that because it's ancient. And it didn't exist during Joseph Smith's time in that form. Or that the Black Sea was functionally a massive freshwater lake during the specific time frame of the 3rd millennium BC, only intermittently connected to the ocean. The science of paleogeography, understanding the historic changes in shape and extent of land and water bodies, was a developing field often tied to geology, which was not a mainstream topic of discussion or education for a young man on the New York frontier in the 1820s. Knowledge from scriptural revelation. It's basically saying he would have had to get the knowledge from scriptural revelation. This is artificial intelligence saying this. In summary, he could have known about the Black Sea, yes. Did he know the specific geographical details of the Black Sea was massive inland lake in the 3rd millennium BC? Likely no. Black Sea or Caspian Sea? Likely no, based on availability of early 19th century secular education. How would the information enter the text? According to his known account and the teachings of the LDS Church. Any accurate obscure ancient geographical details would have been revealed to him through divine inspiration. And I'm going to ask about the aerial sea. What Joseph Smith could have possibly known about the aerial sea. So I will say, could Joseph Smith have known about the size of the aerial sea of 3000 BC? I'll just say 2000 BC. Here's what it says. Could Joseph Smith have known about the size of the Aral Sea of 200,000 BC? That is extremely unlikely, says artificial intelligence, given the general state of the geographical and historical knowledge available to a person like Joseph Smith in the 19th century in rural America. Geography knowledge of the early 1800s focus on known regions. They didn't focus on things that weren't known. Central Asia was remote. The Aral Sea located deep in Central Asia, a region that was geographically remote, poorly mapped, and still being explored by the Russian Empire in the 19th century. Detailed scientific and historic studies of the Aral Sea's past were mostly conducted later. Ancient hydrology was unknown. There's a lot more. I'm going to skip that. So basically, no. Joseph Smith, the maps weren't created of the Aral Sea. The ancient Aral Sea wasn't really known about. I'm not saying the Jaredites crossed the Aral Sea. I'm just saying that's another possibility. But Joseph Smith didn't know about the geography, especially the Paratithesis or whatever it was called in the Aral Sea. He couldn't have known. So my point being is, it is possible that they crossed the went across Asia. So as what I then asked is, the past flood ancestry. So I was just talking about the ancestry. If you believe in the Bible, you can't believe that the ancient Americans have Asian DNA beyond the days of Noah, 4,000 years before Christ. Otherwise, you deny the flood. So I asked the question about, let's see, Is it possible that the Jaredites, being from the Tower of Babel, from an area from where all the nations were dispersed, could have been of the same ethnicity or DNA makeup of the people who became East Asians? If the East Asian people originated, or if their ancestors originated from the area of the Tower of Babel. And it gives me a thing saying, oh, well, the people of ancient America from Asians came over 50 to 80,000 years ago. Well, we know that's not true because of the flood. The hypothesis. I went back and said, okay, I'm not asking about scientific standpoint. I'm asking about biblical standpoint, because if there was a world flood at the time of Noah, all people on the earth except Noah and his family were killed. It answers, yes, you are correct. When examining the possibility strictly from a biblical, theological, or Book of Mormon narrative standpoint, the answer shifts entirely, and it relies on specific chronology that supersedes modern scientific timelines. In this context, it is absolutely possible. It is absolutely possible for the Jaredites and the ancestors of East Asian peoples to have shared the same recent ethnic or DNA makeup. The biblical narrative, starting standpoint, okay, following the flood, there were 8 individuals, we know about that, universal kinship. Every human whoever lived after the flood, up until the time of the Tower of Babel, was a direct descendant of Noah's family, specifically through his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The Tower of Babel event, which the Jaredites predate and depart from, is present at the moment when a single unified group of people scattered across the earth, and their languages were confounded. Therefore, at the time the Jaredites departed from the tower, they, the group that headed toward East Asia, I suppose it means and, the group that headed towards East Asia, and all other dispersed groups were all of the same ethnic DNA makeup. They were all part of the immediate post-flood family of Noah. The possibility rests on the premise of the simultaneous dispersion of Noah's descendants in different directions. Jaredites' path. This group, according to the Book of Mormon, was led by God from the Tower of Babel region, Mesopotamia, across the Sea to the Americas, maintaining their original unconfounded language. East Asian ancestors' path. Another group whose identity is not specified in the narrative, would have had their language confounded and been scattered eastward across Eurasian continent, eventually settling and establishing the great civilization of East Asia. Because the Jaredites dispersed at the very beginning of the scattering event, all people at the Tower of Babel and their great-grandchildren and subsequent generations of Noah. Any group that dispersed from the Tower of Babel would have been had identical ethnic DNA makeup to the Jaredites at that point in time. Their subsequent separation is what led to distinct nations. The possibility is full, and I'm just asking a simple question. So just answer me yes or no. Is it possible the Jaredites could have the same ancestry as the people that were Asians? And according to artificial intelligence, the answer is yes. So the Jaredites could have been Asians. So here is another argument. Now, in the Book of Mormon, Ether says that all of the Jaredites were killed. I have a hard time believing that, because I think what Ether is probably saying is all the Jaredites that he was aware of. Consider how long the Jaredites were here in the Americas. The Tower of Babel was 2,000 years. Suppose even the Jaredites took 50 years to cross 2,000 years BC. Suppose this is approximate. Suppose the Jaredites took 50 years to cross the wilderness and travel and get to the Americas. You're still not far from 2,000 years BC. And the Jaredites overlapped the Nephites until the time of King Mosiah, who became king of Zarahemla. We know this because Coriantumr, who was the last Jaredite, lived among the people of Zarahemla who were Nephites. So there was an overlap. And that was around 2200 BC. So the Jaredites were on the American continent roughly 1,800 years. During that 1,800 years, it is very likely that they dispersed across both the North and South American continents. So Ether could not possibly have known if there were groups of Jaredites who left the main body and migrated to other parts of the continent. And it is possible those Jaredites had Asian DNA, and that they were still here on the American continent during the time of the Nephites. Now, it is also possible that the Jaredites, as they were traveling east, if they were traveling east, and that's a possibility, they were traveling east for so long, it's possible that other groups or other peoples could have joined them. It doesn't say other groups joined them, but there's a possibility. It's a possibility they could have met up with other groups and had marriages, and those other groups could have been Asians. So that is a possible theory, that the Jaredites had Asian DNA, hence the Asian DNA in the Americas, North and South. Now, I understand scientists believe that 50,000 years ago, the Asians came across the Bering Strait. According to the flood that took place in the Bible during the days of Noah, that is not possible. They couldn't have come across the Bering Strait before the days of Noah, because if it was before the days of Noah, they all would have been killed by the flood. So that's a possibility for Asian DNA in America. Asian DNA can be supported by the Book of Mormon story of the Jaredites. Very well, and maybe we'll come up with another recording later. Thank you.